and talk about them. You know what? I'm going to probably start recording this, or Valentina, I think you're going to record this. I just want to announce to everybody that the talk would be recorded and then probably posted eventually on YouTube or something. That's up to you guys how you want to do it.
Yep, the recording has been started, Gregory. Thanks.
Oh, beautiful. All right, so welcome everybody. This is my first talk at Lab49. I've worked as a web developer for many years, and I had to solve a lot of problems in the past, architectural issues that later I wrote about and talked about. And I've seen a bunch of different trends happen, and the one I'd like to talk about today is something that I see happening over the next 10 years. I'm going to make a prediction, and you're going to see it in the talk. But basically, the topic of the talk is how are we building our web applications? Many of our apps use the web and web browsers and so on. How do we deliver the code? How do we execute? And how do we deliver the data and so on? So let me kind of start sharing my screen, and that way we could do the presentation in full screen. Give me a moment. All right, here we go. Can everybody see my screen?
It's good.
Yes, I do, Gregory.
Okay, perfect. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about making the case for how we build our apps, trying to make the case that we should build it client first. So what does that mean, client first? Well, let me take you down kind of a history, down history lane a little bit. So as JavaScript was maturing and getting standardized around browsers, there was sort of this thing with two different movements. One of them was called graceful degradation. That's if a browser didn't support the latest features of JavaScript, your site should still work. But a much easier way was just to put some HTML out there and then enhance it with JavaScript later. So your site could become more dynamic after it actually rendered. So people's experience would be that you see something right away and as soon as possible, and then transparently the site comes alive, if you will. And this was considered the best practice and recommended by pretty much everybody from 2009, we see here. So here we've got progressive enhancement, how to use it. And on the other hand, I think this is Smashing Magazine. On the other hand, 2018, you have different coding boot camps that teach how to do this. And of course, it makes sense. We have HTML rendered, you got some CSS, something pops up on the screen, and then you add your JavaScript. Well, I'm going to say that now things are going to be a little different. So progressive enhancement was coined about 20 years ago, 17 years ago. And it's either that or graceful degradation. W3C also talks about the pros and cons of it. Yeah, before I talk about what I think will happen in the next 10 years, here is what it looks like. We probably all know this, right? We've got your title of the document. You may have some CSS, you have some HTML, and then right at the end, after everything's loaded and the browser has rendered it, your script can then be loaded, and you can defer your script or just put it at the end of the page or however you'd like to do it, and have it actually go to town. So essentially, what I'm going to show you is, here's how we dealt with it. So I worked, this was my startup, and basically how we deal with it at our company was this. You have PHP, and you can render components. We started this before React, before Angular, so this was our own thing. You render some components, and then you activate. In the JavaScript, you kind of just activate them. So, there's a bunch of stuff on the page. Some elements have some metadata, or sometimes you call it micro formats, some information on how to activate this chat room, how to activate this or that thing. And then you would just do it. In our formulation, we called it tools. And tools were behaviors that you could add on any element. So in fact, you can add more than one behavior. You might have, for example, tabs, but also tabs showing items related to some other items. So there could be dynamic tabs that add and so on. So these behaviors would then be added to different elements. Also, on the front end, you want to, for example, react to things changing. So you had Angular, which essentially looks at your data and does dirty checking, decides how your data changed. Or you can have React, which looks at your view and tries to figure out how your view or your DOM changed. And afterwards, it makes some updates to the representation on the screen. But again, this representation is the final image. And underneath that, we started to look at data that's being fed into Angular, data that's being fed into React. And once you decouple that data, things become more interesting. So this is what we used to do: activate things and then run code after it's been activated. So in this decade, it seems that web developers might actually turn this conventional wisdom on its head. And what if, instead of talking about serving HTML and then upgrading it, what if you think the other way? Instead of thinking of the server coming up with all the resources and rendering them and sending them over to the client and then giving the client a way to enhance it, what if we started with the client? And you can think of a local bundle of HTML, CSS, JavaScript as living in just a folder, just a bunch of static files. And those would be rendered in the browser. And then what would happen is the files contain JavaScript, and then the JavaScript would actually go and fetch whatever it needs from the server. It makes the client actually almost like the old way, the applications that you used to buy in the store and install on your computer. That's what it is like. And so the JavaScript is the active part, the CSS is the presentation part, and the HTML is basically the structure of your screens. Okay, so if you think of it that way, what happens? Well, essentially, it's the same as before. You've got this, but now you can sort of think in terms of local applications, like you're building, something that's going to run on someone's computer. And of course, you need to detect features. Can you, for example, pull data using WebRTC? Notice that WebRTC is peer-to-peer. So a lot of the time, it's completely different than pulling things from a server. And that opens up a lot of interesting things, as applications don't even need servers. They can just load up on people's computers and connect with one another, where they might remember each other's addresses or look them up in a sort of directory, like with BitTorrent, for example. So there's Modernizer. There's all these things that allow you to essentially detect browser features in your browser. And these are just two examples. I'm sure if you're a front-end developer, you are familiar with the constant shift in how browsers support new features. So just two new features that I know of are, for example, payment request. That now every browser you can use payments right in the browser. You don't have to save credit cards. No PCI compliance necessarily is needed because there's all this infrastructure that works with Apple, works with Google, and so on. Other ones include WebRTC, which is always getting better and can now encode video and so on. It's what Microsoft Teams uses, actually, as well in some of its web-based clients. So here are the reasons. If I'm going to make a case for this, we're going to have reasons, right? And we're going to have to go through a plethora of reasons. And every case, I'm going to try to sort of lay out the pros and cons and say, okay, it looks like you might want to consider doing things this way. First of all, you want to have separation of concerns. So what I mean by separation of concerns here is the following. You are sending code to run on people's computers. But if you're sending code that's intermixed with HTML and other things, you're sort of, you could separate that out. And of course, people have been talking about JSX and other ways to separate HTML and JavaScript. But what I'm mentioning in this particular module is essentially, what if the code didn't always have to come to your client in one way, which is you go to a server, the server sends a bunch of HTML, and then as part of that, it also sends you the code. First of all, if you separate those two things, you get a lot of benefits, including security, which I'll talk about in the next module. But side loading is a different way to get the code onto your computer. You can get it as a bundle from the App Store. So Cordova is a project that takes your web resources, bundles them up, and then you can use the Apple Store, the App Store, and the Google Play Store to essentially download those things onto your computer. This is a different paradigm because all your resources are now on your computer. And we're going to that bundle paradigm where you could just load a file and it is right there. Everything is offline first and is able to work without any servers on the internet, which is also nice when I get to the social impact of these things, when people can actually use their apps without having to have a fast broadband connection or a connection to another country where the servers might be located. They could actually choose their servers to be located locally and maybe run software there. So if everything is static files, then obviously we don't need any very fancy backends like Facebook has or Twitter has. And it may actually be that people can host kind of almost their own software, similar to how you have Ethereum wallets or Bitcoin wallets, which are self-hosted. And so you got this whole trend now of self-hosting things. You also now have these companies like Google and Apple, these makers of app stores, create snippets. It's kind of like replicating the web a little bit. So on Google Play Store, they call it Play Instant Apps. And on the App Store, Apple's, they call it App Clips. And essentially what it is you discover something in the wild, maybe a QR code or Apple's proprietary thing here that looks like a different kind of code, which is kind of cool, like a fingerprint. Anyway, you scan that with an Apple device or with the Google device, and suddenly a bunch of code is downloaded in a sandbox and you can run it. And then if you like the app, you can get the whole app. So again, the idea is that if all your stuff already bundled on your phone or on your device, then it's essentially something that can work offline and pull in resources and cache them as needed. You can also trust that code, which is what I'm going to talk about next. I should also mention that the web has now service workers, which essentially do the same thing as long as you visit the website. The difference, though, is with trust. So when can you trust the code? Well, if you actually have signed code, like in the app stores, you can trust what's being delivered. And since we work a lot with banks and financial institutions, trust is very important. So being able to actually sign a bundle is important. And it's not just the organization that publishes the bundle that can sign it. In fact, they can publish anonymously, and some third-party security audits can look at the code, say, okay, yeah, this is, the code compiles to this, right? So they have the open source code that was shared with them, and they look at it and say, yeah, okay, we've done the testing, and this version is still secure. We do that. That's very important if you start pulling things in, especially when you have package managers. You've probably seen like NPM. There's sometimes a story that it pulls something in that's been compromised because some developer somewhere is responsible for a module, and someone pushed code that then was pulled that wasn't audited by most of these projects. So trusting code is easier when you're getting a bundle that's signed by someone who's audited this thing, right? And that's what happens with Linux and others that are loaded on financial computers. But with the web, we just visit a website and it just spits out code. And it can easily change up the code anytime. So one thing is, if you trust the top-level document that was sent to you, the website, then the web introduced sub-resource integrity, which basically says that the rest of the code or the rest of the resources, images, JavaScript, etc., is going to be pulled from CDNs and other places, maybe other domains which you don't have much control over. But if it doesn't exactly match your hash that you know it should have, then it's rejected. So sub-resource integrity says essentially, as long as I trust your domain, right, I still have to trust your domain to give me that top level document. The rest is, your domain already told me what the document is. The document has SRIs and essentially pulls in trusted resources. Problem is, of course, with the web, except for the, yeah, with the web, you have to trust the domain, the server that serves the domain. It has access to your cookies. It has access to your local storage. It's kind of very powerful. Even though the web sandboxes everything by domain, you end up trusting these domains, and that leads to a kind of a feudalism model where you can't really have self-sovereignty on the web so easily, at least not with normal web browsers. We're going to talk about that in the social impact when we get to the social impact part of this. Okay, so you can see that like with Cordova and native apps, you can sign the entire app, including the top level documents that will be loaded. So you can trust the local bundle even more than you can trust a website, because with the website, you're still trusting that server that you're visiting, and here you're not. Here, you could have third parties, others, like it's sort of like Zagat food reviewers, right, or whatever, except for security. They say, okay, this gets an A, or, oh, there's a big vulnerability in the version you're running, so get this version, stuff like that. So again, very important for banks and financial institutions to consider this type of application deployment. There are certain things that you can do to sort of start trusting the server that's like far away, 3,000 miles away on the other side. What can you do? Well, you've got to trust companies like Intel. Intel now creates chips and security guard extensions, SGX, that basically allow you to have these secure enclaves in memory. And then the CPU kind of, well, Wikipedia explains it pretty well. The CPU essentially says it encrypts that particular memory and only decrypts it if others within that memory want to access those things. So it's sort of self-contained units in memory, and it does attestation. It says, okay, I'm Intel, I've signed this. You can trust that this was made by Intel. If you trust Intel, and that's your trusted computing base, then you can trust all this stuff going forward. So that's pretty good, because every day we trust Apple, Google, Intel, others. And I think this, there's all these hacks, like the recent hack now this talks about with SolarWinds and the Chinese, Stuxnet is an example of like zero-day vulnerabilities in Windows. We have to trust something. We have to trust some trusting computing base, so it might as well be Intel, I guess, or Apple. So that reduces the attack surface. In fact, Signal, the private messenger, has ingeniously started using SGX to essentially protect your contact list. Because think about it, your contact list is being uploaded to the server, and maybe those are just hashes. But the phone number, there's only like 10 digits. So you can pretty much figure out, given the hashes, what the phone numbers are. And you can include a salt or whatever, but there's still only a space of like, I don't know how many, several billion or whatever. So what Signal does is essentially says, well, we won't be able to access your contacts, and we can prove it to you by using Intel's SGX. So it could prove it to the client. This is going pretty far to try to get security when all you need is this. All you need is to sign the client, but you have to get away from the idea that the server has all this data. And of course, that's the other thing with regulations is you need to sort of, data is almost like you're allergic to data with all the stuff now with the European, the GDPR and the California's Privacy Act and how things are going, data becomes a liability. And so it's interesting to be able to have people be self-sovereign on their devices with their private keys on their data, and then only take what you need. Kind of flips the whole model on its head. So that's the trust angle. Decentralization of actual code. So not just trusting the code, but the code itself comes from all these different places. It could be that, different people decide to install different components on their machine. So I might decide on Microsoft Teams to install some plugin, and that plugin could access data on my machine. I'd like that to be sandboxed. So for example, if I'm reading an email, I'd like that email to stay on my computer, and I might run some JavaScript in there, in that sandbox, but I don't want that JavaScript to go and phone home any information at all, because as soon as you let it phone anything back, it can phone back anything. So essentially, loading third-party JavaScript, there are now sandboxes being developed for this. You could have on the web post message between domains. And what that means is essentially there's a lot of trust going on. Yeah, the domains are sort of these feudal lords and they decide what to do, but you don't have any say in it. If a domain decides to trust another domain, it does. So they can collude against you and sort of still post message to each other. Same thing here, but as long as you control your domain. So another thing you could do is you could have your own domain, your own server on the web that you trust. Perhaps it's encrypted only for you, and then it gets decrypted when you log in. Whatever it is, you trust that server. And if you do, then all these things are available to you, like iframe sandbox and SRIs and everything like that. What if, instead of having your own server on the web, you could have a fake virtual server in your own app, in your own Cordova app? It would intercept all requests to your server, HTTPS/whatever. It would see that prefix and say, I'm going to substitute files from the local bundle, and I'm going to pretend like I'm a server on the web, but actually I'm only responding to things, local requests. Then you could see all kinds of things, your contacts, your emails, your name, etc. And you could secure that on your phone. Again, it's going beyond just the web to something like the web plus a local server on your phone that's intercepting a lot of the requests. So like almost like a proxy intercepting stuff. The deployment, let me see how we're doing on time. Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna talk for another 20 minutes and then I'd love to leave 15 minutes for question and just discussion afterwards. So we're about halfway through. Deploying things on the web and in app stores. So like I've said, deploying things on the web is instant. There has to be something, you could visit a website and things could change from under you easily. There's no way that you could really prevent that. And so on the app stores, on the other hand, you're sort of more in control. Unless you turn on automatic app updates, it's going to be, you're in control of like when things happen. Now, I know Microsoft is now, and other companies are trying to end that and get constant updates to you. And that could be pretty dangerous sometimes. And you just got to hope that those companies then are not compromised. There's a cool talk on the web called the day like passwords ended at Google or something, like somebody pushed the code. There's like 5 trusted people at Google. I'm not sure if that's true, but the talk is pretty interesting, so you can go check it out. The Beaker browser. Beaker browser is built on one of these peer-to-peer technologies called DAT, D-A-T, which is now called HyperCore or Hyper something. It's just the Hyper project. So if you look for HyperCore or any one of these things, you'll find essentially a cross between BitTorrent and Git. So you have a file system and it's syncing up with other people that have that particular, say, folder, right? It's a bit like IPFS, but I think it's an older project and I frankly like it a lot. It's got funding from the Knight Foundation and a bunch of other people. It's completely free and easy to use. So you deploy this thing and it syncs with syncs up with other sources, let's say. So just like BitTorrent, it can grab things from 5 places at the same time, grab chunks, grab streams. It's really cool. What do you do with this? Well, you have static files in your bundle, and then other people have them, and they find each other through this decentralized thing called a distributed hash table, like Kademlia. And that's one of the routing, that's actually the main routing mechanism in both BitTorrent and DAT. So the Beaker browser is literally completely different than DNS, which is DNS is domain name system, kind of a federated database that you have the domains at the top level, the TLDs, and then registrars work with the International Consortium of Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, and they have a rule to put that into like the federated database. Think of it as a pyramid. By contrast, Kademlia or DHTs are essentially the names, the domains are not human readable. They could be like AZ12345, like a long string, but they don't have to be human readable because what's being presented to you is the title of the document or a link to a page. And those things typically have titles or images. And so once you realize that you don't really need to see the URLs underneath these things, almost the domains almost go away too, because now you've got these, just everything is on the same level. Any magnet link or onion link or whatever you want to call it in Tor or this, they're all equal. And so if they're all equal and they're all on this giant domain, they don't trust each other. And so trust becomes individual sovereignty and what you decide to give people. You may share your DAT with other people. So you can edit websites and you can host websites using this. You can see how it looks. You've got your files here on the left and you've got your editing on the right. It's kind of interesting to play around with. This technology is experimental, but it's very secure compared to the web, funny enough, because it's encrypted end to end, and it could be encrypted end to end, and it's it's very hard to take down. And I'll show you in 5 minutes a project which has been running from 2006 called Made Safe, which now they call it Safe Network, which essentially goes even beyond this and makes your sites so it can't be taken down. Each site lives in its own ID on this, distributed system that is just more and more people can join. It's like sort of like, it's not blockchain, it's a distributed system that's end-to-end encrypted. Everything is chunked, stored redundantly, and like you can't take down anything. So of course, because of that, everything is client-based. So there are times when you do need to have server, you do need to have simple HTML. One of them is when you're sending out emails. So you're sending people emails, the email client is going to render some HTML. That's a federated system based on domains. Someone at something.com, right? Something.com runs an SMTP server, gives you these things. And of course, with email, there are things like you can have counters that count down. You can see how many times somebody opened an email. Although now with Gmail, they cache that thing, but they still allow you to track if the email was opened. So that's email. You probably need it. Also, landing pages. Of course, the first experience that you ever get with a brand or with somebody getting an invite, click a link, should be fast. And of course, there's hundreds of customizable templates and so on that you could get. And if you want to do search engine optimization, not all search engines are going to run your JavaScript. So of course, you'd like to be able to have that. And there's a lot of guides to that. Finally, embedding widgets in other web pages. You want them to load fast. Everybody complains about just pulling in too much JavaScript. So if someone else's website is pulling in your stuff, then you probably want to keep it lean. AMP by Google is a big example of this. And now getting sued for antitrust because they said that they kind of, people claim they artificially inflated the comparison with regular web pages, and that could be true. And again, AMP is a standard by Google, but the idea is that you strip down everything if you're going to be including your widgets in a web page. In this case, Google's search engine. Facebook, of course, goes the other way. It has widgets that you can embed, and you would think they try to make those widgets, as lean as possible, and they probably do. But of course, embedding those widgets, they can track people across the web. So Safari browser, especially on the phones, Apple tries to have a reputation for privacy, a very public reputation. So ITP, Intelligent Tracking Prevention, is disabling third-party cookies in these things to try to make sure that you can't be tracked. And just recently, like a few days ago, Facebook and Apple are in a spat now because Apple's now locking down even more. And so Facebook won't be able to tailor its ads as much. And they publicly complain about it and so on. So that's interesting to see as well. Also, Apple, I think also Facebook is being sued for antitrust again. Well, for different reasons, because they bought WhatsApp and Instagram and again, so these are ways that our society is trying to solve these problems of feudalism on the web. It's too big. What do you do? Well, one thing is that you might want to own your own data. And if we get to a world where data is liability, then perhaps companies will want people to own their own data and only take what they need. For example, do you really need to show, why do you need the first and last name of a person if they're just using your site? Just to show it back to them, right? If that person posts something on your site, they might have a pseudonym or a username. So that will track them across the site. But why do you even need those? Who really cares? Like most of the time, I don't remember who that was from 6 months ago. You could just have user IDs that are not human readable, and so on. So then if you go that route, why do you even need people's photos? Sometimes you can find people's photos in a widget, and then you can run that through Facebook and find their actual account by just correlating the pixels in the photo with the pixels on their public account. And again, that's a vector that, why do you really need that? Like, what exactly is the benefit? Mostly the benefit is people can see a social experience. They kind of feel good that there's some people smiling going to your event, but that's about it. They don't know most of those people coming, and they certainly don't know people in a giant room or forum, like with 1 million people talking about some topic. So why do you even need that? Okay, so decentralization of data is basically about how everyone hosts their own thing. Tim Berners-Lee just 4 years ago left MIT, like maybe 2 years ago, got funded to the tune of several $1 million to start a company to basically do this decentralization of data. So you can look it up. It's called Inrupt. Reliability of access. So it's often the case you go there and the link's dead, or there's just the service not available anymore. Google, shut down Google Reader. But if Google Reader was a desktop app, they couldn't shut it down. You could just keep using it. So again, if you have to rely on a company to just give you your code every time, they could just pull it. There's pros and cons to it, but again, it would be nice to own your own apps. Finally, end-to-end encryption. This is a sort of controversial thing, and you could see, you could also see the Attorney General, in the last 4 years, Bill Barr, and other AGs, and law enforcement, really grinding their teeth with this end-to-end encryption because they say they can't predict when the next terror attack is going to happen. On the other hand, people are saying, look, I don't want everybody to just read everything, even a state actor. That's a whole other separate topic, but I would say that if you're relying on end-to-end encryption to have a good society, then you probably already failed, and you probably need to work on your government and your system rather than just sneaking around only. So end-to-end encryption can't solve every societal problem, but it can definitely help when your adversaries are not state governments, but just competitors and so on. So the SAFE network, this is the one I was talking about, the most secure one that I know of. They've been working at it since 2006. You can see their code on GitHub. It's quite advanced, and they have many innovative approaches, including Kademlia, distributed hash tables, end-to-end encryption, chunking, everything that you had in BitTorrent, and so on, and something from also blockchains. So they call it data chains. Anyway, check it out if you're interested. This is going to happen in the next 10 years. I really believe these guys are going to finally launch something and going to go to market with it in the next 10 years. But just for perspective, they've spent the last 14 years building this. So you can go read about it, pay once, store forever. And guess what? You're paying with cryptocurrency, another thing where you don't have an account and everyone's self-sovereign. So essentially, the future, if this ever goes to end-to-end encryption, this will look like people paying for resources with cryptocurrency and having no accounts at certain areas. And the reason is because if you have accounts, then they can track you and perhaps change your balance. But with cryptocurrency, instead of quotas, so right now we have quotas. An account can do this many things in this amount of time. With crypto, the idea is if I have enough money to pay for these things, enough tokens, then I can do these things. And how did I get the tokens? That's none of the business, I guess, of the provider. And the provider themselves are not one entity, but actually just dumb boxes storing encrypted stuff. So it's it's sort of the next generation of of the web, if you will, Web 3. So let me just run through this, and then I want to leave time for questions. So data delivery. If you're serving everything on the server, then essentially, first of all, like I was talking about, these data delivery can be locked down using sub-resource integrity. And also there's issues with like sending cookies and authentication between domains, etc. But bandwidth and repetition. So what happens is if you send things from a server, think about it, you're basically mixing your data inside HTML. And I know that the presentation layer is usually called CSS, but look at what you're doing. You're shipping all these TD tags along with your data. And that's a bit of a weight on the wire. But what if you could just ship JSON, right? Then the client would have to unpack the data and it would have to insert it in there. But of course, that's nice because the data is completely decoupled from this particular embedding in HTML. So again, that would be very much client-centric. Client presents you an interface, it goes, grabs some data from here, grabs some data from there, mashes it up in the client, and everything is trusted, secure in the client, maybe sandboxed so it can't phone home, etc., etc. So it could be nice. If you are going to grab data, then you'd like to do all these things: cache the data, throttle your requests, and batch the data. So sometimes you don't want to have these functions where it says grab these 100 rows, 100 objects. Instead, different parts of your code need different objects. It may be that some avatars need, user data on these people, and then some avatars and some other widget need data on those people. You batch that all together, so you kind of wait. You hold the door open until there's like 50 milliseconds. It's called debouncing. 50 milliseconds, you wait, and then you send out the request with these 100 batched things, right? And if the batch is too big, you split it up and then get it all back, etc. It would be nice if you could take a function that gets stuff and just wrap it in a wrapper that does all these things: getting, throttling, and batching, caching. And that's what we did at Kubix as well. So in my company, we basically did that. You could wrap any function that gets stuff in QGetter, and then you just, whatever you get back is a smart function that does caching, throttling, etc. And also you could do QBatcher that's basically going to create batching for you. It's just a middleware that helps functions work like that. So if you're going to deliver your data, it's being delivered either as a CDN. It's either going to be preloaded from your server, the origin server, because okay, I'm on this page, you're going to need this data. CDNs, are some server that's going to cache things from your origin server, maybe hide it from denial of service attacks and other things like Cloudflare, and bundles, which is essentially the App Store delivering. Keep in mind, people are used to waiting like a minute or 30 seconds to download an app. Because they're so used to it, you could use that time to just push megabytes and tens of megabytes of information, which you couldn't just do on a website. So keep that in mind, just the psychological aspect of it. Cloudflare works with all these things from the Jam stack. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to run through this. The Jam stack essentially is all these new things that allow you to create static sites. Static sites are cool because obviously it's easy to cache. It's at every layer of HTTP. It's easy to do a proxy or anything. And of course, there doesn't have to be any application code running to generate it at request time. So there's Gatsby. It can be used for headless CMS, which is what I've spoken about, which is essentially grabbing things from databases, WordPress, Ghost, whatever, and kind of mashing it up and having your own, your own system in the front end. So you've got, Jamstack, you've got Gatsby, you've got Hugo, Jekyll, 11T, and now Next.js. And just recently, like 2 days ago, React is touting these 0 bundle size components. So everything old is new again. So basically now you've got React, which works on the client side, telling you, hey, your bundle is going to be 0, nothing's going to be shipped to the client because we get to render it on the server. So kind of most of this talk was like the opposite of this. But I do want to say that if you start on the client and you have it working, it may not be as efficient as on the first render sending stuff from the server. So I would say instead of having to tie it all in, instead of having progressive enhancement where you render a bunch of inert HTML and then enhance it with JavaScript, rather than doing that, imagine building your whole thing as static files with JavaScript, rich experiences, pulling data in, and then doing things like zero bundle size React server components, optimize your bundle size, optimize your response times, but only for the first render, stuff like that. See, this is 2 days ago. So the social impact, this is what I want to end with. The social impact, today, the web, people trust large corporations with their proprietary newsfeed algorithms and all that to manage their own data, their own identity, and their own brand. So Facebook could take away your identity by just not letting you connect with Facebook anymore. Or you could shut down your profile or your page. So this has led to massive new issues for individuals, society, and that includes their own governments and how we all relate to one another. We always need to use something. Like here we're using Microsoft and their software, and that's nice. But again, we're trusting them to keep our best interests at heart. So that's the relationship we have now. I think in the next 10 years, it's going to shift more towards people owning their own identity and brand. It's almost going to be, it depends on what the governments do, but if the data becomes much more expensive to collect, use, etc., then corporations are going to collect less of it. So attempts to resolve these issues are ongoing. There's a loose movement out there called to decentralize the web. I'd say Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others are another approach to all of this. And Tim Berners-Lee is trying to do something as well. So that's basically it. Here's a list of all different issues that just, I wrote this, I think 2 years ago. And you can pick any month, and there's more of this. Scandals, privacy settings, leaks, hacks, people's data being, stolen, etc. Passwords. So if we're going to move to a web that's client first, we're taking an activist stand, and we're basically saying, we're going in the direction of individuals almost having more control over what they install, what they run, and having their data never leave their device unless it's with specific permission to their friends and their contact list. And then these companies like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn become almost like just that really big connector friend that you have that has a lot of people. But anyone could really run that connector hub, not just LinkedIn. So that's sort of the idea. Yeah, let's discuss. And if you have any questions, I'm sorry I went a little bit over, but I hope this was interesting. And I hope that we can start a discussion group after this. So if we don't have time to get to everything, we can maybe just have a group on Microsoft Teams and discuss it further. So thank you very much.
So that was very interesting, and I'm sorry that I caught kind of the second half of this. But I'm kind of curious what your perspective is on the social aspect of this. So I'm very happy that the technology exists, right? Because people can't whine and say, well, we can't do that. It doesn't exist yet, right? But essentially what you're proposing here will shut down the surveillance economy as it exists, right?
Probably. So
that's big business.
That is big business. And it's not just business. Like if you look at a lot of these things that happened, this was back in 2018, Russia passing laws that can land you in jail for criticizing the government. And these are real links. Basically, thousands turn out to protest Russia's bill curtailing internet freedom and so on. Of course, these issues happen across the world. In China, it's already very advanced. There are ideas of what you can share and what not. It's not just corporations, but at corporations, of course, they want to personalize the ads, and that's big business. The thing about this big business is it gets less lucrative every year. Ads are in a race to the bottom. So a lot of the ad-based revenues, if you notice, like YouTube's playing more and more ads all the time, right? And Facebook's trying to get more and more people to constantly click on something. And they're sending you all these things like someone you don't know posted something and someone commented on it, so take a look. It's not an accident. It's because they're getting less and less money over time. So I think they're going to move to other things. And because of GDPR and because of California's privacy law and Canada's privacy law and all these other ones, it's becoming more expensive to even have that data. And I think if the economics don't make sense anymore, then they'll be like, you know what? I mean, perhaps we should look at other business models. So I would say that from a business perspective, that's what's going to happen. But I'm more interested in the social perspective, because if people can run their own software, they can do a lot more than if they. Let me give you this one example. America Online, 20 years ago, had all the software. They had the one place where you've got mail, right? Everything was there. But when the web came out, the ability to run your own site on your own server was so compelling that it killed AOL. It killed a lot of, because it didn't adapt, right? So if you're able to have an open system that anybody can have access to their own web server or their own thing, people eventually migrate to that kind of thing, like WordPress, being able to host your own blog rather than medium.com. It's fairly competitive in the marketplace, but it has to exist. Like you said, if it doesn't exist, there's nothing that can compete. So first it has to exist, and then it has to be good enough so that people can actually say, okay, I could see myself using WordPress instead of hosting on some site on this one site. And the same thing, I think it has to be good enough.
Do you have any
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Greg. I was going to ask if you had any sense or any predictions about what type of business model could potentially replace an advertising-based model.
Business models include things like, for example, if you have a community, let's say your local community can have group discounts for your local megachurch or whatever. Let's say it's a big community at local venues, at local merchants. If you have a building, the dog walker would like to walk 10 dogs at the same time instead of one dog. Once this economy opens up and people can go to movie theaters again, they're going to want to get group discounts and so on. There's a lot of things where people want to start an economic activity, and sites or apps that help them to do that, I feel, will be able to profit. But at the end of the day, the only thing that ever can get you profit is network effects, because everything else is going to be in a race to the bottom. It's, you're going to have an app that charges $10, but then if it's an open source app, it's going to be free, and then the hosting is going to be on your phone. Everything tends towards free. Like this Microsoft Teams is using voice over IP, and only 20 years ago, the cost would be $3 per minute with AT&T just for the voice, right? And now, because of the packet switching, the cost rapidly went to zero because of voice over IP. So the back end is not where you make the money anymore, or at least it's very cutthroat. So where you make the money is the interfaces and the beautiful stuff that you could use here. So I think for the next 10 years, we're going to have the beautiful interfaces, and 10 years later, we're probably going to have business models around group discounts and economics like that. But I think that over time, decentralization will happen anyway, because it's just like when people get the technology, they don't need a third party to give it to them. And then it becomes interesting of how they connect, and we have a collaborative society. That's a long-term trend that I see, although, it's anyone's guess where it's going to end up in 10 or 20 years from now.
So this is a very interesting perspective, because I actually have very much the opposite perspective in terms of decentralization from a packaging perspective. So I do a lot of work with packaging, and one of the issues that we keep running into is that there's no central authority on how to build BLOS, for instance, one of like the core linear algebra libraries. And so we have a lot of people at loggerheads where they can't actually agree on what BLOS should look like. And so lots of problems happen. So I'm always thinking like, oh, well, we should centralize this because people actually don't care about this. They just want an answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have very much an opposite approach. It's like, well, everybody has everything. How do you handle that kind of fundamental disagreement on, for instance, like what an API should look like?
So that's a great question. Matrix.org is another group that is very active in this space of letting you host your own thing. And they recently wrote an article about what would you do that's an alternative to one centralized group deciding, let me ask you this. If the NSA is one centralized group and they have access to all the emails, and I know I'm going from it backwards, but you really have to trust that one place. And then you hope that your democracy works and you can constrain them and they're going to be honest with you and so on. And that's the same with everybody. Facebook, large corporations, you have to trust them and they have to be accountable. But what if instead each group can decide for itself? Like, for example, kosher certification for food, vegan certification for food. Why do you need one organization to do that? Different people might have different needs. There's a GATT survey of how the restaurants are doing versus the city giving an A, B, or C to the thing. So let me just see if I could find this. Make.org. What would I think it's surveillance or something like that. They published this recently. Okay, before I do that, I do want to say that like I was thinking about this back like 8 years ago, and I published on my blog things like solutions to security, privacy, identity, and censorship. There's this interesting article from 2003 called The Digital Imprimatur. And this guy was claiming that because everyone's IP is sort of, there's a limited amount of IPs and other things, eventually the web's going to be locked down. And you could see some of that happening, like what you're saying. There's Microsoft is having like trusted boot sectors and only certain OSs can run. Apple has that, but it's choosing not to use it. It's choosing not to lock down its computers, but it does lock down its phones.
I mean, for Apple, I think the better example is the fact that every application seems to have to phone home in order to decide whether or not it's allowed.
Yes, that's a much better example. You're right. So would you want that? I mean, one thing could break the entire, there's one point of failure essentially for this, right?
Oh, and that thing has been utterly catastrophic for me personally. Just like the idea as a person who ships packages, like that is just awful.
It's basically centralizing the responsibility in the hands of one top-down organization. And who knows, if you corrupt that one place, like SolarWinds was like used in so many different places, right? But if it's decentralized, then what happens is, here, I wrote this like 8 years ago. Any network which is concerned about user account spam just needs to tie them to something expensive, like a cell phone. And I guess in 2012 I knew about Bitcoins. So that's kind of cool. Reputations. So people can have reputation relative to a site, and they could have their own user account, and they can earn karma points or whatever on the site. So if you have a lot of spam, just have people earn that over time. Verification. If an account on the network is marked as verified, these are called verified claims on the web. There's a standard for that now. So party A says that party B has verified that they are indeed a licensed doctor or whatever. And so party A signs it, and that certificate can then be used in all sorts of ways. Identity, in fact, is just a bunch of those certificates together. So I'm a doctor, I'm a good husband to this woman, let's say, I'm this, I'm that, all these things have to happen. And then that I may reveal some parts of my identity, not others. So that's certificates. And signed software and software on the web. So I'm actually surprised that when I was doing this talk, I didn't realize that I had started to think about these things about 8 years ago. But yeah, go ahead.
If I can kind of come back to, I think you made a very interesting point with the kosher and vegan. I'm not associated with that, but for instance, you could imagine a vegan community that says this is vegan, and a different community that says this is not vegan. And so that's where I see some friction, right? Where there are parties disagree fundamentally on what they think is or isn't correct.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you match those two communities up? Like, how do you handle that interface?
I think the beautiful thing is that you don't have to. The idea is that people form communities by self-selecting themselves. Like we speak English because it gives us a big network effect. If I was learning Esperanto, it wouldn't give me such a big network to speak with. So I really want to have to learn it just for the fun of it. So you get access to network effect when you join a culture, or maybe religions work this way in some way. But also if you decide to use a certain currency, like the US dollar, or you join a certain thing. So people self-select into communities. It's not, you're not forcing them. Now, if a certain community, let's say there's a dispute about this region of Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so some people want it labeled Armenia. Some people want it labeled Azerbaijan. What do you decide, right? Well, if you have an Armenian community running their software, they're just going to call it Armenia. And the Azeri people are going to call it Azerbaijan. And they don't have to fight over a global truth. It's just what, it's relative. It's all relative at that point.
Current events would disagree with your discussion about whether or not they need to fight. But your point about English, I think, is a little bit better. I have definitely watched people struggle Americans struggle with British television, for instance. They actually have genuine difficulty understanding what people are saying.
That's
right?
True. I think some British people have difficulty with certain dialects in Britain, but that's what they told me when I was in London. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, sometimes I wonder, like, I think if you grow up in a small town and you move into the city, your accent changes because you only have access to certain people in your town that understand you clearly. And then once you become a news anchor, you have to have this mid-Atlantic accent between the British and the English and so on, British and the American English. Yeah, I would say it's an investment. Learning a language is an investment. Buying Bitcoins is an investment. Getting Ethereum or any other new thing is an investment. So people make that investment in various degrees and to the extent their means allow them to, and their time allows them to. But they get the experience that they sign up for, essentially.
Sure. Sorry, to bring this back to very concrete software stuff, and then I'll promise I'll stop talking because someone else should definitely talk.
It's all good. I like it.
This reminds me very much of Microsoft's embrace, extend, extinguish. Like this is the extend aspect, right? Where you have two websites, they don't have compatible APIs anymore because there's no Hobbesian Leviathan forcing them to agree on how the JSON should be formatted. And then how do you handle
that?
I
see your question. Well,
sorry, that took
wouldn't
way
be
too
any
long on my part.
Look, I think there's web standards, and I think that the developers voluntarily converge to trying to use them. I'm obviously oversimplifying here because there's the what WG. I don't even know what that stands for. WHATWG, and then there's the W3C. And the browser makers constantly try this innovative. They try to innovate. Maybe it's not even a malicious thing. They're just trying to get their thing out there, and then they just don't want to change it to be the standard thing. So I would say that the people who are creating the software, there is one area in which I would say there should be centralization. So it sounds like I'm advocating both things, but the platform, I would say, and this is my own personal opinion, and many people have disagreed, I think there should be a monoculture in the web browser. Like it should be an open source project that's not owned by any company. And if you want to fork Chromium, go ahead, but people should be able to merge your changes back into Chromium or whatever. And that should be the platform. Everyone targets one platform, and that would stop wasting all this time on compatibility issues across platforms. So I agree that the base layer of rendering storing stuff or the IP stack, right? All that stuff can be like not even a standard, but like one reference implementation. And there should almost be like, unless you have a really good reason like Beaker browser to like fork something, just merge it back into the main line. I don't have all the answers because that then has a bunch of politics in there. And obviously there's going to be acrimonious debates about everything. But for the rest of us, you're right. It's much cheaper to just have 20 people debate than having 2 million people debate with 2 other million people. So I agree with you that some things should be standardized. I just think that at some point, as you get out of those concentric circles of like putting stuff on the screen, pushing bits across the network, like when you get to the point of like, and what's going to be on my blog, or can I even have my own blog with my own data? Like my data should not be treated the same as like an internet standard is. So I would say there's a continuum. So yeah, centralization for, you know, browsers and pipes, but not centralization for what's it called? For storing your own data, managing your own data, communicating with your friends, like that kind of stuff. Who cares? Like if you're naming it Armenia or Azerbaijan, like if most people in the world do not care about that conflict. Not to say that many people care deeply, but most people do not. So why should they have just one way? So the example is Google Maps has to deal with this. They have to play politics. There's only one way they can name it, or they secretly name it a different way for some people. But OpenStreetMap, you can just download the tiles and rename them however you want. That's the difference between Google, a top-down organization, and an open source project, which has, and I'll just say one last thing about that. Clay Shirky was a guy who gave a lot of TED Talks and stuff about 15 years ago. He has a great TED Talk that's called Institutions versus Collaboration. And he was kind of predicting, like I am now, that the next 15 years are going to be marked by a shift away from infrastructure like TV channels, newspapers, etc., and to collaboration like Wikipedia, open source, science, you know, gift economies. I think his vision has partially only come to pass, but I think eventually that collaborative model will gradually replace the competitive model, which says, come to us, we have the software for you. We have the best software, pay us less than our competitors, because that's in a race to the bottom, and eventually it's going to end up at free. And when it ends up at free, then people are going to say, well, now I want to own my own data. So that's at least how I see it. Anybody else? I think everyone's muted here, so. Going once, going twice. Brian, I just wanted to say thank you for, first of all, helping to set this up. This was Brian's idea. Very much he helped me to shape this talk as well. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what's next for this, and you know, is this a series, or how do you want to sort of, where do we go from here?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, definitely thanks for doing this talk. I think it was really, really interesting. A lot of kind of new concepts. I mean, especially to me when you get really deep into the details, and definitely curious to see where things go. So hopefully everybody else found this interesting too. In terms of this being a series, I mean, yeah, I've definitely been trying to get more of these tech talks happening on a more regular basis. So I'll just put it out to everybody else that's on the call now. If you're interested in doing one of these tech talks or contributing in some way, definitely reach out to me. More than happy to figure out how to get that started and offer whatever support that you might need to actually create and present the talks, handle all the logistics, and everything else that goes along with it. We don't currently have any other tech talks scheduled right now, but I would love to kick off a few things in the new year. Having said that, some of you may have been in attendance for the Why Tech Leadership panel discussion that we did that was hosted by Jason Seminara. We're definitely going to be doing that again. Tentative plans to do that in January. No final date yet, but definitely keep a lookout for that invite in your email.
All right. Well, thank you. I just want to say again, this was a pleasure. I'd love to do it again. And I'd love to hear tech talks by other people. And if we can set up some sort of like forum afterwards, then I think we can keep the conversation going because there's a lot of threads here, and obviously not something that we can just cover in one shot, but hopefully something that can help also with development here at Lab49. I think some of these ideas can help inform, like the data privacy stuff and other stuff can really help. So, yeah. Thank you again, and I want to wish everybody a very good vacation if you're taking one, and see you in the new year.